Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Between Two Worlds. I am your host, Annika, and on this cozy morning, I'm actually recording outside next to a fire with my hot coffee after this full moon. And well, today we are going to discuss something that most people, or even witches for that matter, may not know of. Or if you do, maybe you haven't really connected it to your practice in a way that you never knew that you could. And that is the sin eaters of medieval ages. This isn't something that they teach you in history class, and it's definitely not something that shows up in your average Witchcraft 101 book, but I think it should, because sin eaters represent one of the most raw, honest, and frankly uncomfortable examples of folk magic and death work that we have historical documentation for. And I think there's really a lot that we can learn from them, not just historically, but practically for our own work with the dead and our own tendency to take on burdens that really don't belong to us. I also think that this topic opens up something much bigger, whole conversation about ritual consumption, about feeding and eating as a magical act, about the folk technology that underlies so much of what we do as practitioners. The Sin Eater isn't just a historical curiosity, there are a key, really, that unlocks an entire system of magic that really most modern practitioners use without fully understanding. So, first, before we go any further, what is a sin eater? Well, in its simplest form, a sin eater was a person, almost always poor, often a social outcast, sometimes disabled or mentally ill, who was hired by a family to come to a funeral and ritually consume food and drink that had been placed on or near the corpse of the recently deceased. By eating this food, the sin eater was believed to literally absorb the sins of the dead person, taking those sins into their own body and soul so that the deceased could pass on into the afterlife unburdened, clean, and forgiven. The sin eater, meanwhile, walked away carrying all that weight, and then they did it again and again for years, sometimes for their entire lives. This practice was documented primarily in England, Scotland, Wales, and later in Appalachia from at least the 1600s well into the late 1800s. And honestly, probably longer than that in isolated communities. The last known sin eater, a man named Richard Munslow, died in 1906 in Shropshire, England. And here's the thing that gets me. Munslow wasn't even poor. He was a farmer who took up the practice after losing several of his own children, apparently because he understood the weight of grief and wanted to help others find peace. But he was the exception. Most sin eaters were people who had no other options, doing work that everyone needed but no one respected. Now, before we go deeper into the practice itself, I do want to talk about why this matters for us as practitioners because, I know some of you are probably listening and thinking, okay, interesting history lesson, but, what does this have to do with my craft? And really, I think everything has to do with everything in your craft. First, sin eating is magic, full stop. I don't care that the people doing it might not have called that, and I don't care that it was wrapped up in Christian language and imagery because we are going to talk about that later. But what we're talking about is ritual consumption, the deliberate act of taking something into your body to create a spiritual effect. We're talking about transference, moving something from one person or place to another through symbolic action. And we're talking about someone serving as an intermediary between the living and the dead, helping souls transition, carrying weight that others cannot carry, really that psychopomp energy. Now, that is witchcraft and that's death work. That's the kind of liminal boundary crossing, maybe technically shouldn't be possible kind of work that practitioners have been really doing for thousands of years under 100 different names. Second, sin eating may be a thing that you might be doing without even realizing it. When it comes to the living, at least, have you maybe ever done a reading for someone and felt their grief or trauma settle into your body afterward, or done a cord cutting work or banishing for either you or a client and felt like you needed to sleep for 3 days? Or have you ever sat with maybe a dying person, a loved one, or helped someone process their dead and walked away feeling like you were carrying something that wasn't yours? And if you've ever been the person in your family, maybe your friend group or your community, who everyone comes to with their heaviest shit, and you just absorb it. You take it in because someone has to, because they can't hold it anymore. And really, this comes down to the fact that you have the capacity and that they don't. And to me, that is a form of sin eating, right? That's the same energetic mechanism, at least, the same spiritual labor, just without the bread and the ale and, well, the corpse in the room. You know, here's really what I've learned the hard way. If you're doing the work without recognizing it, without protecting yourself, without having any practice for releasing what you've taken on, it will eat you alive. And many people do this without knowing. Or if they do not understand the toll it takes on your physical body after it overflows from your spiritual body. And really, they thought they were just being helpful. They thought, they were just being good witches or good healers or good friends. And no one told them that this kind of labor has a cost. No one told them that you can't just keep swallowing other people's sins and expect to stay whole. So, really, let me tell you a little bit about my own experience because I think it's important to ground this in something real before we go any further into the sort of historical weeds. And really, I didn't realize I was kind of a sin eater, I guess, terminology, until I started really paying attention to what was happening in my own body. And here's the thing about my family, and I suspect this is true for a lot of families. No one knows how to hold their own shit. No one knows how to sit with their own darkness, process their own trauma, carry their own burdens. So, really, what happens is it gets passed around in this endless circle of someone pushing their weight onto someone else, who pushes it onto someone else, who pushes it onto someone else. That grief, the anger, shame, fear, all the heavy stuff that people don't want to feel, it doesn't get processed, gets transferred. And somehow, without ever volunteering for the job, I became or one of the people it got transferred to. I didn't sign up for this. I didn't outrightly say, yes, I'll carry your unprocessed trauma. I don't think most people do, but I didn't agree to be this family sin eater. But it happened anyway. Because when you're even slightly more capable of holding heavy emotions than the people around you, when you don't immediately crumble or lash out or shut down when someone dumps their darkness onto you, you become a target. You become the vessel. And really, the fucked up part is, I didn't even realize this was happening at first. I just thought I was tired, I was stressed, and I thought something maybe was wrong with me. Why did I feel so heavy all the time? Why did I feel like I was carrying weight that didn't make sense for my own life? And that was kind of the biggest factor there. And it really took me a little while to connect the dots, to notice that I felt worse after, certain family interactions, to notice that my body was holding tension and heaviness that wasn't mine, to realize that I was absorbing things that I never agreed to absorb. And that's the thing about involuntary sin eating. It doesn't ask permission, it just happens. And someone can't hold their grief, so they cry on you and walk away feeling lighter while you feel heavier. Someone can't process their anger, so they rage at you and discharge it into your nervous system. And someone can't face their own shame, so they project it onto you, and suddenly you're carrying this sort of guilt that was, had nothing to do with your own actions. And this is what happens in family systems. This is what happens in communities. This is what happens whenever there are people who can't or won't process their own stuff and other people who are just absorbent enough to catch it. And you can't just cope with this. You can't just get better at carrying other people's weight. That's really not sustainable and that's not healthy. That's the path to burnout, illness, depression, spiritual depletion. So you have to find a way to stop it. So I did, I put a stop to it, not perfectly, not all at once, but deliberately and consistently. I started building protection practices specifically designed to prevent this kind of involuntary transfer. I started noticing when someone was trying to dump their shit onto me and consciously refusing to receive it. So when you've been the family sin eater for maybe even years, people don't like it when you stop. They're used to you carrying their weight. They feel abandoned when you won't do it anymore. They might even get angry because now they have to actually deal with their own stuff instead of passing it on to you. But, I'd rather have people be angry at me than slowly poison myself with burdens I never agreed to carry. And the historical sin eaters often didn't have a choice. They were poor, They were desperate, they needed the sixpence, and but you have a choice. You can put the bread down, you can refuse to eat what others are trying to feed you. So, with all that said, let's get into the actual historical practice because the details are fascinating and honestly kind of metal. So, the most detailed account we have of sin eating comes from a man named John Aubrey, an English antiquary who wrote about the practice in the 1680s. And Aubrey was one of those, obsessive collectors of folklore and local customs that, the kind of person who wrote down everything he observed because he sensed that the old ways were disappearing. Aubrey describes sin eating like this, and I'm paraphrasing here, but when a person died, the family would send for the sin eater. This was usually someone known in the community for doing this work, not a profession you advertised, but word got around. The sin eater would come to the house where the body was laid out, and a loaf of bread and a bowl of beer, sometimes ale, sometimes milk in certain regions, would be directly placed on the chest of the corpse. In some accounts, the food was placed on a wooden board or a trencher that rested on the body, and the sin eater would then eat the bread and drink the beer directly over the body, sometimes literally leaning over the corpse to consume the food that had been touching it. And in doing so, he would take on all the sins of the deceased. And Aubrey records a specific phrase that sometimes was spoken during the ritual. The sin eater would say something to the effect of, I give easement and rest now to thee, dear man. Come not down the lanes or in our meadows, and for thy peace I pawn my own soul. Amen. So let's think about that for a second. For thy peace I pawn my own soul. The sin eater is explicitly acknowledging the exchange. And I'm taking your burden so you can rest, and I'm accepting the spiritual consequences of that choice. This isn't unconscious folk superstition. This is a deliberate spoken contract between the living and the dead, witnessed by the community. And after the ritual, the sin eater would be given a small payment, usually a sixpence, sometimes a groat, sometimes just the leftover food and drink. And then he would leave. Often he would be driven out, actually, chased away, because now he was carrying the sins of the dead and no one wanted that pollution lingering around. So the community really needed this person. They believed, genuinely believed, that without the sin eater, their loved one's soul would be trapped, burdened, unable to rest. And this was essential spiritual technology. And yet, the moment the work was done, the sin eater became untouchable, contaminated, something to be driven away. In the Welsh tradition, has some variations that, I find particularly interesting, and Wales seems to be where the practice was most deeply rooted and longest lasting. In Wales, sin eaters were sometimes called funeral bakers, and the bread used in the ritual was specifically prepared for this purpose. It wasn't just any bread grabbed from the kitchen. Some accounts describe special funeral cakes or biscuits made with particular ingredients. There's a lot of potential here for your own magic, kitchen magic, though the specific recipes weren't recorded. The bread was, sometimes marked with a cross or other symbols before being placed on the body, and some accounts describe the bread being passed over the body multiple times or even broken into pieces that represented different sins. And there's a suggestion in some folklore that different types of sins required different amounts of bread, as if, there was kind of a spiritual accounting happening, a calculation of how much needed to be consumed to clear the debt. And the beer or ale was sometimes poured directly onto the chest of the corpse before being collected and drunk. This liquid pooling in the hollows of a dead person's body, absorbing whatever essence or residue lingered there, and then being drunk by the sin eater. I don't know if you guys can hear those crows, but they're everywhere this morning. Now, in some communities, the sin eater didn't just consume food, they also received items that had belonged to the deceased. Clothing, small personal objects, things that carried the essence of the person. The sin eater would take these home with them, essentially creating a physical anchor for the sins that they had absorbed. Some accounts suggest that sin eaters accumulated these objects over, years of practice, living surrounded by these possessions of the dead whose burdens they carried. And really, there's something almost archaeological about that image. The sin eater's home as a repository of death filled with objects that once belonged to people whose sins now lived inside the sin eater's body, almost like a living grave or a walking memorial. Now, in the Scottish traditions, they have their own variations. In parts of Scotland, the practice was called Dichaloof, if I'm saying that right, and involved the sin eater consuming food from a dish placed on the breast of the corpse. Scottish accounts sometimes mention the sin eater being given the dead person's shoes, perhaps symbolizing that they would now walk the path of the dead person, couldn't complete it, or perhaps really just a practical gift of clothing to someone who was usually desperately poor. And in the Scottish Highlands, particularly, the accounts of a similar practice involving a dirge woman who would keen over the body while consuming ritual food and drink. The keening, that high wailing lamentation, was actually believed to help guide the soul, while the consumption of food absorbed the spiritual weight. Sound and eating combined into this single ritual technology. Now, in Appalachia, where the practice survived the longest in the Americas, sin eating merged with other folk traditions brought over by the Scottish, the Irish, and Welsh immigrants. The isolation of mountain communities allowed old practices to persist long after they've died out in their countries of origin. And Appalachian accounts describe the sin eaters speaking directly to the corpse, actually, asking permission to take on their burdens. And this is a significant variation. It suggests a more reciprocal relationship, a negotiation with the dead rather than just a service performed for the living family. The sin eater might say something like, "Do you give me leave to take your sins?" Or, then wait for a sign. And that could be a flicker of candlelight, a settling of the body, a feeling of assent before proceeding. Others describe a more elaborate ritual involving candles, salt, specific prayers, though prayers might be a generous term for what were essentially spoken charms, and, salt on the chest of the corpse, candles at the head and feet, bread and cider consumed in a specific order while walking around the body a certain number of times. Some Appalachian accounts mention that the sin eater was, being required to spend the night with the corpse after the ritual, a kind of wake or vigil where they would sit with the body until dawn, ensuring that the transfer was complete and that the soul had truly departed. And this echoes older traditions of sitting up with the dead that were common throughout the British Isles and their diaspora communities. Now, if you're a practitioner listening to this, especially if you work in any kind of folk magic tradition, your ears are probably perking up right now because what I just described, ritual consumption, transference through food, feeding objects and spirits, this isn't some obscure historical curiosity. This really is the backbone of folk magic worldwide. In many, many variations of folk practice, one of the most fundamental technologies we use is feeding. You feed your magic, whether it be a bag, a charm, a talisman, and so on. You don't just make it and forget it. You give it whiskey, you give it condition oils, you breathe on it, you keep it warm against your body. Why? Because it's alive. Because it needs to eat to stay powerful. Because the relationship between you and that bag is maintained through regular feeding, just like any other relationship. Now, no matter how the cookie crumbles, really, you need to feed your workings, whatever you call them. They need regular nourishment. Whiskey is one of the most common feeds, but also Florida water, conditioned oils, oils and spiritual waters that you make on your own breath, and even bodily fluids. And the object consumes these offerings, and in return, it works for you. You feed your lodestones with magnetic sand, you feed your spirit pots with offerings, you feed the crossroads when you go there to do work, you feed your ancestors, your house spirits, your dead. And on the flip side, when you want to work magic on someone, one of the most effective delivery systems is their food or drink. You get something into their coffee, their liquor, their meal, they consume it, and it becomes part of them. Now your magic is inside them, working from within. And this is the same technology that sin eaters were using. The bread and ale absorbed the sins of the dead through contact with the corpse. Then the sin eater consumed that charged food, and the sins transferred into them. The transference magic plus consumption magic, two of the most fundamental folk techniques really combined into one ritual. So let me break this down further because I think understanding these principles can transform really how you approach your own practice, even if something I say here inspires a tiny little thing. So, eating and drinking are some of the most powerful magical acts available to us. When you consume something, you're not just interacting with it, you're taking it into yourself. It becomes part of you. It crosses the boundary of your body, enters your bloodstream, gets broken down, and integrated into your cells. This is why kitchen witchcraft is so effective. This is why potions and brews and magical foods show up in every tradition worldwide and especially in TV. And this is why I did a whole episode on coffee because, when you drink something with intention, you're not just ingesting substance, you're ingesting energy, information, and magic. Love magic that involves feeding someone food you've doctored with your own bodily fluids, whether that be menstrual blood, sexual fluids, spit. The target consumes part of you, and now they're bound to you. Part of you is literally inside them, being digested, becoming part of their body. Healing charms where you write a prayer or a psalm on paper, dissolve it in water or alcoholic drink, and then you drink it, the words enter your body. The sacred text becomes part of your flesh. Or even when you whisper a charm over water or food and then give it to the sick person to consume, the words charge the substance, and the substance delivers magic directly into the body. And now communion itself, and we'll talk again more about the church later, but where you eat the blood and body of Christ, you consume the divine. God enters your body through your mouth and stomach, and the principle is always the same. What you eat becomes you. We've all heard you are what you eat, and you become what you eat. Sin eating takes this principle and applies it to the heaviest possible material, the spiritual residue of human life. All the guilt, the regret, the unfinished business, the weight of every wrong thing a person did or failed to do. That's what the sin eater is consuming, not just the bread and the ale, but everything those items have absorbed from proximity to the corpse. This works, obviously, in both directions. You can consume something to take it into yourself, like the sin eater taking on sins, or like drinking a tea you've prayed over to bring healing into your body, or you can feed something out of yourself, like feeding your charm to keep it strong, or leaving offerings for spirits to maintain your relationship with them, and feeding, taking in and giving out. This is the pulse of folk magic. And really, this bi directional feeding is pretty much everywhere. You feed your tools to keep them alive and working. You feed certain magical workings to your targets to work the magic on them, and you feed spirits to maintain relationships and gain their favor. You feed the crossroads, the graveyard, the river. Everything is eating and everything is being eaten. The same principle shows up in, spirit work more broadly. When you make offerings to spirits, ancestors, deities, land spirits, whoever you work with, you're feeding them. They consume the essence of what you offer. Some traditions say they consume the spiritual steam or energy of food and drink, and others say they consume it on a different plane of existence. Really, however you conceptualize it, the relationship is maintained through feeding. And when spirits feed on offerings, they become stronger. They become more present and more able to act in the physical world. A well fed ancestor altar is a powerful thing. A neglected one goes cold and quiet. And Sin Eater was, in a sense, allowing the dead to feed one last time. The corpse couldn't eat anymore. That capacity was gone. But the sins, the spiritual weight, could still be transferred through food. The bread and ale became a kind of proxy stomach, a way for the dead to discharge what they could no longer process themselves. So now let's talk about transference, because this is, another key mechanism that makes sin eating work. Transference magic is the practice of moving something, an illness, a curse, a spiritual burden, a quality from one vessel to another. And it shows up constantly in folk magic, wart charms that transfer the wart onto a potato, a piece of meat, a snail. You rub the wart with the object, then bury it or throw it away. As the object rots, the wart disappears, and the wart has been transferred from the body to the object. And I bring this up because actually, I used to get warts a lot on my fingers when I was a kid, probably from, I don't know, constantly playing in the dirt and catching frogs and stuff. But I remember my abuela doing the potato trick for me quite well. Now there are also egg cleansings, which same, but different from Olympia, which, when it comes to Olympia, the closed practice elements would likely be more traditional and religious aspects of the deeper roots of Credendissimo, but many broader adapted practices of it are very commonly used and really have been. Anyway, it's where you roll an egg over someone's body or yourself to absorb negativity, illness, or magical attack. And the egg takes on what was afflicting the person. Then you crack the egg into water and you scry, basically. You read it or dispose of it. Now, puppet magic, where you create a doll to represent a person and then do things to the doll that affect the person. The puppet becomes this vessel for transference. What happens to it happens to them. Candle magic, where you load a candle with a person's concerns and intentions, then burn it. The burning transfers the intention from the physical object into the spiritual realm where it can manifest. The principle is always the same. You can move spiritual weight from one vessel to another. The vessel might be an object, an animal, or a place, or in the case of sin eating, a person. And what makes sin eating unique and intense is that the vessel receiving the transfer is a living human being. It's not an object that can be buried or burned or thrown away. A person who has to keep living with whatever they've taken on. And there's another layer here that I want to explore, and that's the connection between sin eating and other forms of death contact magic. Think about, all the folk practices that involve touching or using parts of the dead. The hand of glory, a candle made from the dried hand of a hanged criminal, used by thieves to paralyze the inhabitants of a house, and the hand of someone who died violently, preserved and transformed into a magical tool. There's graveyard dirt, which it could be a whole nother episode on its own. There's corpse medicine, the historical practice of using parts of human bodies for healing, skull moss, mummy powder, human fat, blood, and blood from executions. For centuries, European medicine incorporated human remains as powerful curatives, really. And the logic was that the life force of the dead could be transferred to the living through consumption or application. Touching a corpse for healing. Folk belief throughout Britain and Europe held that touching a dead hand could cure warts, goiters, and other ailments. The illness would transfer to the dead, who would then carry it away when they were buried. And some accounts actually specify that the corpse had to be of the opposite sex or had to have died in a particular way for the cure to work. There's also corpse coins, the coins placed on the eyes of the dead to keep them closed, later removed and used in magic. And these coins have touched death, have been in contact with the transition between life and whatever comes after. They carry that liminal power. Corpse water, water which was used to wash a corpse, saved and used for cursing or binding. The water, has touched death, has cleansed and cleaned the body of its last impurities, and now carries that deathly essence. Now, sin eating fits right into this complex of death contact magic. The bread touched the corpse, the ale sat on the chest of the dead, sometimes even poured over it, and the contact transferred something. The sins, the spiritual weight, the unfinished business of human life, and then the sin eater consumed that transfer's essence. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds like communion, and this sounds like the Eucharist, bread and wine, body and blood, the ritual consumption of something sacred to achieve spiritual transformation. And this is where we get to talk about the church because the relationship between sin eating and Christianity is complicated. So here's the thing, sin eating existed in a Christian context. The people doing it were Christian, at least nominally. The families hiring them were Christian, and the sins being consumed were understood through a Christian framework of guilt, redemption in the afterlife. In that sense, sin eating was a Christian practice, but the church hated it. And I mean, hated. Sin eating was condemned by clergy at every opportunity. It was called superstition, blasphemy, a mockery of the sacraments. Priests railed against it from the pulpit, and church authorities tried to stamp it out wherever they found it. Why? Because sin eating did something the church claimed only it could do. Think about the Catholic system of salvation. You sin, you confess to a priest, the priest grants absolution, and your sins are forgiven. If you die without confession, you go to purgatory at best and hell at worst. The church controls access to forgiveness. The church holds the keys to the afterlife. And that's an enormous amount of power and an enormous amount of money when you consider how much people paid for masses, indulgences, and other spiritual services. And then here comes some, filthy beggar with a loaf of bread doing an end run around the entire system. No priest needed, no confession required, no tithes, no penance, no submission to church authority. Just a simple ritual and sixpence, and your loved one's soul is clean. You can see why they hated this and had a huge problem with it. The church's objection wasn't really theological, it was economic and political. Sin eating threatened their monopoly of salvation. It said, actually, we don't need you, and we have our own ways of helping our dead. We have our own spiritual technology. Thank you very much. This is the same pattern we see with cunning folk, with midwives, with herbalists, with anyone who provided spiritual or healing services outside church control. The church didn't condemn these practices because they didn't work. They condemned them because they did work, and that was competition. What's particularly ironic is that the Eucharist itself is a form of ritual consumption for spiritual transformation. You eat the bread, you drink the wine, you take Christ into your body, and you are transformed. The mechanism is identical to sin eating. The only difference is who's authorized to perform it and what institutional framework it exists within. So let's push this just a little bit more. The doctrine of transubstantiation, the Catholic teaching that the bread and wine literally become the body and blood of Christ during the Eucharist, is one of the most magical beliefs in Christianity. Not symbolically become, but, not spiritually become, literally, physically, actually become human flesh and blood while retaining the appearance of bread and wine. This shape shifting, this transformation magic, this is the kind of thing that would get you burned as a witch if you claimed to do it outside of the church. And then you consume it. You eat the flesh of God, you drink his blood, you take the divine into your body through the most primal animal act possible, which is eating. The church fathers wrote extensively about what this consumption does to the believer. It purifies, it strengthens, it grants grace, it connects you to Christ, and through Christ to eternal life. The sacred meal transforms the eater. How is this different from sin eating? In mechanism, it's not different at all. Both involve ritual consumption of specifically prepared food. Both involve transference and communion. The grace of Christ transfers to the believer. In sin eating, the sins of the dead transfer to the eater. Both involve transformation of the person who consumes. The only difference is institutional authorization. The priest is allowed to perform this magic because the church says so. The sin eater is condemned for performing similar magic because the church says so. And, here's the thing. The church's version is arguably less honest about what's happening. The sin eater knows what, they're taking on, what burden they're taking, and they know there's a cost. They accept that cost consciously, even speak it aloud, for thy peace I pawn my own soul. But the church tells you that communion is all benefit, no cost. You receive grace, you receive blessing, you receive eternal life. There's no acknowledgement of what you might be taking on, what you might be binding yourself to, what obligations you're accepting when you consume the body of God. At least the sin eater knew the deal they were making. The Protestant Reformation didn't make things better for sin eaters, by the way. You might think that rejecting Catholic authority would open space for folk practices, but actually the opposite happened in many, many places. Protestant reformers were often even more hostile to folk magic than Catholics had been, and they rejected the whole system of intercession. No saints, no prayers for the dead, no purgatory. In the Protestant view, your fate was sealed at death. Nothing the living did could help the dead, and nothing the dead did or needed could provide by human ritual. This theological position directly attacked the logic of sin eating. If the dead's fate is already determined, if there's no purgatory to escape from, if prayers and rituals can't help the departed, the sin eating is not just unauthorized, it's pointless. It's superstition. It's a remnant of Catholic error that needs to be stamped out. And yet sin eating persisted, especially in rural areas, especially in places where the old ways ran deep. People kept hiring sin eaters because they needed to believe that they could help their dead. They needed the ritual, they needed the closure. And theological arguments from distant clergy couldn't compete with the immediate visceral need to do something for the people that they had lost. This is something that, I see over and over in the history of folk magic. Official religion says one thing and the people do another because the people have needs that official religion just doesn't meet. And they'll find ways to meet those needs regardless of what the authorities say. So if sin eating is magic, and it is, what kind of magic is it explicitly? So let's break that down. The mechanics more systematically, I guess, because, you know, I think understanding really step by step how this works can actually help us apply similar principles to our own practice. So first, the ritual consumption. And we've talked about this already, but let me emphasize how fundamental it is. Eating and drinking are magical acts because they cross the boundary of your body. Your skin is a barrier between you and the world. Your mouth is a gateway through that barrier. When you put something in your mouth and swallow it, you're allowing the outside world to become part of your inside world. This is intimate and it's vulnerable. Every culture has food taboos, things that are you're not supposed to eat or not supposed to eat at certain times or not supposed to eat in certain combinations. These taboos exist because people intuitively understand that eating is not neutral. What you eat affects what you are. And the sin eater weaponizes this understanding. They deliberately consume something that has been charged with this spiritual weight. So, second is transference. The sins don't disappear, they move. They transfer from the dead person to the food, and from the food to the sin eater. Conservation of spiritual energy, if you want to think of it that way. This is crucial to understand because in most magical systems, you can't just make something vanish. I don't think there's any magical system that I've heard of where you can just make something vanish. Energy, all energy is borrowed, and you move it, you transform it, bind it, redirect it, but you can't just annihilate it. The sin eater isn't destroying the dead person's sins; they are relocating them. They're taking them out of the dead person and putting them somewhere else, namely inside of themselves. This raises an obvious question, right? What happens to the sins after that? Do they stay in the sin eater forever? Do they accumulate over years? Can they be released or discharged somehow? And historical sources don't give us any clear answers. Some accounts suggest that the sin eaters were permanently polluted by their work, that the sins they consumed stayed with them until death or perhaps beyond. Others hint at purification practices, fasting, prayer, ritual bathing that might have helped discharge some of the accumulated weight. My suspicion is that different sin eaters handled this differently, and that the ones who lasted the longest in the profession had some kind of release practice, even if it wasn't formally documented. Third is the substitution. The sin eater serves as a substitute for the dead person. They take on the sins so that the dead don't have to carry them. This is sacrificial logic, the same logic that underlies scapegoating rituals, substitutionary atonement, and yes, the Christian concept of Jesus dying for humanity's sins. The scapegoat ritual in Leviticus is a perfect parallel. The priest lays his hand on a goat and confesses the sins of the people over it, transferring those sins to the animal, and the goat is driven out into the wilderness, carrying the sins away from the community. The sin eater is a human scapegoat. They carry away what the community can't deal with. They bear the weight so others don't have to, and like the scapegoat, they're driven out after the ritual, sent away, shunned, treated as contaminated. Fourth is liminality. The sin eater operates in liminal space between the living and the dead, between the sacred and the profane, between the community and its margins. They're present at the moment of transition when the soul is leaving and the body is becoming a corpse. They consume food that has touched death, they carry pollution that makes them untouchable, and this liminality is what gives the sin eater their power. They can do what others can't, precisely because they exist outside normal categories. They're not bound by the rules that govern ordinary people because they've, already been pushed beyond those rules. And this is pretty much true of witches generally, isn't it? We operate in the margins, in the spaces between. That's where the power is. That's where the work gets done. And the Sin Eater is just particularly a stark example of this principle. Someone who lives permanently in the liminal, who has made the threshold their home. Okay, so now I do just want to mention, we have almost no first accounts or first person accounts from sin eaters themselves. Everything we know comes from outside observers, antiquaries like Aubrey, clergy who condemned the practice, and families who hired the sin eaters, court records from witch trials, even. And the sin eaters themselves were usually illiterate, usually poor, and usually marginalized in ways that meant their voices weren't recorded. So we have to read between the lines. We have to imagine what it was like based on the fragments that we do have. Imagine being called to a house where someone had just died, the family's grieving, maybe even wailing, maybe sitting in stunned silence, the body's laid out, already starting to cool, already starting to look less like a person and more like a thing. You're not there as a mourner, you're not there as a comforter, you're there to do a job that everyone needs, but no one wants to watch too closely. You approach the body, you see the bread on the chest rising and falling slightly as the last gases escape from the corpse. You see, the bowl of ale, maybe with a film forming on the surface. You know that this food has been absorbing something, the sins, the weight, the unfinished business of human life. And then you eat it. You put that bread in your mouth, you chew and you swallow, you drink that ale, maybe still warm from sitting on a body that hasn't fully cooled, and you feel it go down into your stomach. And you believe, you feel that something else is going down with it, something heavy, something that doesn't belong to you. And then you leave. You take your sixpence and you go. And behind you, the family feels relief. Their loved one is now clean, and their loved one can now rest. The burden has been lifted. But you're carrying it. You walk home with the weight of a stranger's sins inside your belly, in your soul, and tomorrow, or next week, next month, you'll do it again and again and again. What does that do to a person? What does, it feel like to be a professional bearer of other people's spiritual weight? I think about the sin eaters who did this work for decades. Richard Munslow, the last known sin eater, practiced for years. Others are recorded as having done this work their entire adult lives. How did they cope? How did they make sense of what they were carrying? Some of them probably didn't cope. Some of them probably broke under the weight. The historical records, hint at sin eaters who drank heavily, who went mad, who died young. And really, this isn't surprising. But some of them must have found ways to manage. Some of them must have, developed practices, maybe not recorded, maybe not even conscious, for discharging what they'd taken on. Maybe they had their own rituals, their own prayers, their own ways of passing the weight along to something or someone else. Or maybe they just got used to it. Carrying the sins of the dead became normal and became part of who they were. Maybe they stopped noticing the weight because it was just always there. And well, I don't know. I can't know. But I think about them. I think about, what they sacrificed so that others could have peace. Okay, well, finally, I want to bring this back to us, to modern practitioners, to the work we do in the weight that we carry. Because, like I said at the beginning, some of you may be sin eaters. You're doing this work without a name, without the ritual structure, without the conscious awareness of what you're taking on. And really, I mean that in carrying the burdens of living, there's ways we can do this within our spiritual practice as well. But how do we start to do this work consciously? How do we engage with the technology of sin eating, the ritual consumption, the transference, the bearing of burdens without destroying ourselves? First, you have to make it conscious. Before you do any work that might involve taking on someone else's weight, a reading, a healing, sitting with someone in crisis, doing death work, acknowledge it explicitly. you know, Say what you need to say out loud. This simple act of consciousness acknowledgement changes everything. It transforms you from a passive sponge absorbing whatever comes your way to an active participant, making deliberate choices about what you will and won't carry. Second, you can create ritual containers. The historical sin eaters had a ritual structure. There was a beginning, a middle, and an end. Bread was placed, the bread was eaten, and the sin eater departed. The container was clear. Create similar containers for your own work. You can light a candle at the beginning of work and extinguish it at the end. You can put on a specific piece of jewelry or clothing when you're doing heavy work and take it off when you're done. Use a specific space for this work and leave that space when the work is complete. Then, third, you can practice release. And this is a part that hopefully many people don't skip. But after you have done the work that involved taking on any kind of weight, you need to release it. Don't assume it will dissipate on its own. Don't assume you can just carry it indefinitely. Actively, deliberately move it out of your body. And this could be into really anything, the ether into a container of some sort for work later. You know, there are many ways to do this. You can do physical movement, you can shake, dance, run, just feel human again. There's water, you can bathe, shower, swim, adding salt and hyssop and Florida water to a wash and, cleansing it over your body. You can breathe, breath work can move stuck energy. There's, earth, fire, sound elements, go outside, take a walk, or write down what you've taken on a piece of paper and burn the paper, letting the fire kind of transform it. And obviously the sound. You can sing, chant, tone, drum. There's, a lot of things here. Sound vibration can shake loose what's stuck. And the specific technique matters less, really, than the intention and consistency. Find what works for you and do it every single time you do any sort of heavy work and make sure to make it non negotiable. Fourth is feed yourself. And this one might seem obvious, but it's often overlooked. If you're doing work that depletes you, you need to replenish yourself. And I mean this both literally and magically. You can eat nourishing food, drink plenty of water, get enough sleep. Your physical body is a vessel that holds everything else, so take care of it. Magically, you can do practices that fill you up, not just practices that empty you out. Spend time in nature, again, connect with even your spirits and ancestors who support and strengthen you, and do magic for your own benefit. Okay, one thing I want to finish this whole conversation off with is working with ritual consumption for the dead, because this is where the Sin Eater's technology can be most directly applied in modern practice. Now, one of the simplest and most powerful things you can do for your ancestors or beloved dead is to share food and drink with them. This is already common in many traditions, leaving plates of food on your ancestor altars, pouring libations, setting a place at the table for the dead during holidays. But you can take this further by consciously consuming food on behalf of your dead, which many, many, many traditions, I think, or at least practitioners, say not to do. But, what if there is a moment when you can do this? And I have experimented with implementing this very sparingly in my practice, but when I'm doing very intensive ancestor work, especially with ancestors who carried a lot of weight in life, trauma, addiction, mental illness, poverty, whatever, I'll prepare a small meal specifically for this purpose, simple food, bread, salt, water, alcohol, or, more specifically, something that they enjoyed. And I'll sit with their photo or a representation of them and I'll speak to them directly. I'll say something like, I'm going to eat this food for you, whatever you're still carrying that you're ready to release, let it pass onto this bread, and let me help you lay it down. And then eat it slowly, deliberately, and full of awareness of what I am doing. Now, this is crucial. I don't just absorb it and hold it. After I've consumed the food, I do release work. Another practice is the shared meal. So when you eat with your ancestors, and I mean really eat with them, not just leave food on an altar and walk away, you're creating a bridge. You're both consuming the same substance, you're joined through food. This is basically going to be like your dumb supper, but with, minor changes. Prepare a meal for your ancestors, set their place at the table, serve them first, and sit down and eat with them, eating the same food for yourself. In silence, maybe, and with full attention on their presence. You're not just sin eating here. You're taking on their burdens. You're communing. You're sharing a meal across the veil, and the food becomes the medium through which you meet. This is old magic. You know, humans have been eating with their dead since we first started burying them, and with grave goods and food offerings, the Sin Eaters ritual is just one variation of this ancient theme. Another practice is eating your intentions. One of the, simplest folk magic techniques is writing your intention on a piece of paper, then consuming it. This can look like many, many different things. You know, you can dissolve it in water and drink it. You can put it in your coffee filter with your coffee and actually brew coffee or even tea through the parchment. You can burn it and mix the ashes into your food. You can simply chew it up and swallow it if you're not precious about it. But what you're doing here is taking your intention, which started as a thought, became words, became written symbols, and bringing it into your physical body. Now let's close with something that's been sitting with me through this whole episode. So, sin eating and sin eaters were marginalized people doing essential work. They were poor, they were outcast, they were considered polluted and untouchable. And yet, without them, the communities dead couldn't rest. Without them, the whole spiritual ecosystem would have been disrupted. And there's many ways to honor the sin eaters themselves. The ones whose names we'll never know, the ones who carried the weight of countless dead so that families could have peace, and the ones who were needed and used and discarded. You know, this can mean simply honoring them and inviting them to a space on an altar or however you engage in your spirit work. So with that, I have to say that's all I've got for you today. I know this one was heavy. I might have jumped around a bit, but I think it needed to be said. You know, sin eaters have been forgotten by history, dismissed as superstition, even erased by the same institutions that made their work necessary. And I wanted to bring them back, at least for a little while. I wanted to honor what they did and what it cost them. And I hope this episode brought something new to you in some way. And as always, thank you for being here with me. And wherever you are in the world, I hope you have a wonderful morning, day, or night.